we've never met, but I'm the person who suggested that we do this particular topic. I think
Okay,
it's going to be fascinating in terms of implications on state policymakers, which is what we're all about. Um, and that's why I suggested it. Um, I'm glad to have you here and interested in hearing what you have to say. So why don't we get at it?
great, great, terrific. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Um, I am going to share with you today a version of what I've been sharing with different legislative committees in the last couple of weeks, particularly jobs and workforce, both in the House and the Senate have seen this presentation. And I welcome questions all the way through. If I can see that you have a question, or if you want to interrupt me, that's just fine too. Since we're a cozy group here, I think we don't need to be all that formal unless you all prefer it. Let me share my slides here with you. Can you see my presentation in full screen?
Yep, we can see it.
That's coming through? Okay, good. All right. Um, and just let me make one small adjustment here to my screen. Okay. Um, so one of the things that I'm tracking lately and that I'm telling everyone about who will listen is that Minnesota is undergoing a transition to a slower growth state. And this is very expected. This isn't a surprise to any demographer or anyone who's been watching this for some time. It's the natural outcome of having an older population and having lower birth rates. But we're really just at the point where we're experiencing what that slow growth means to our communities and our institutions and to our public budgets. And so I'm going to walk you through kind of what that looks like, why it's happening now, some of its implications. And again, I'm happy to take questions as I go. Um, Specifically, I'll be talking about the slower population growth overall, older age structure that's happening. We've all heard about the aging of the population. We'll look specifically at the timing and implications of some of that aging right now. And then I'll really focus on slower labor force growth, which is what I've talked to both the House and Senate about in recent weeks. So this is the total population for almost all of time as Minnesota's been a state. And you can see that there's been steady growth all the way from 1860 that I have here up until about 2010. And that's when that growth started kind of tapering off. The dotted line is our projection for the future. And our projections are based on both our age structure, our birth rates, our rates of mortality, and then also rates of migration. And so if we put those things together with our recent history, we just come up with very slow growth going into the future. Minnesota isn't alone in experiencing this slowdown. It's happening nationwide. It's especially pronounced in the Northeast and the Midwestern states, as you can see here. But even in the fast growing southern part of the US and western part of the US, those states are also experiencing slower growth than they had in previous decades. So while the Midwest and Northeast tend to grow much slower than the southern and western part of the US, the slowdown is really across the board, being driven both by population aging and by lower birth rates. Looking back to Minnesota here, one of the things that's happening is our internal growth engine of natural, what demographers call natural change. It's just the number of births in the state minus the number of deaths. That's slowing. And we used to rely on that for a lot of our growth. We just thought it would kind of assumed it would always be there, right? That we would always have more births than we had deaths. But as we age as a state and as a country, we have more people who are in the high mortality age groups, meaning we have more deaths. And then also as our birth rates are falling, we just don't have that same level of growth that we've had in the past. Our projections suggest that by the end of the 2030s, our natural change will be actually negative. It'll go into natural decline, meaning we'll have more deaths than we have births in the state. And at that point, the only way for our state to grow will be from migration, either from other states or from outside the US. Some states are already in natural decline. Minnesota actually looks pretty good on this front when compared to some of our Midwestern neighbors that have already reached that kind of tipping point where they have more deaths each year in their state than they have births. So while this is new for us and it's a very different growth context than we're used to, it's happening across the US, and some states are actually in a more difficult position in terms of growth than we actually are. And one way to just kind of drive home what that lower birth rate looks like in Minnesota is just to look at the age of our young people. This is showing you a pyramid for 2024, and at the bottom we have our babies, and at the top we have our 17-year-olds. And you can see that each year, almost every year, year after year after year, gets to be a smaller and smaller cohort. And that's happening as birth rates fall and as we have kind of a smaller number of people in their childbearing years. Now, when we look at Minnesota's birth rate overall right now, we are below replacement fertility, meaning that demographers usually say 2.1 is the estimate of the number that each woman of childbearing age has to have, 2.1 children, in order to replace herself and her partner. And right now, Minnesota is at what the fertility rate is at 1.7 children. Every state in the US is below replacement fertility. And what that means is over the long term, that we will not make enough babies to replace ourselves. That's just kind of the tipping point, that 2.1. And so we're on this trajectory towards slower and slower growth built into this, this lower birth rate. Again, it's not unique to Minnesota. It's not unique to the US. It's a global phenomenon. Even countries like India that once had very high birth rates are now below replacement fertility levels. And so there's been a massive change. It's going in one direction. It's kind of a normative social change with economic ties. But it's not something that we can look into kind of the context of Minnesota necessarily and say, aha, that's why Minnesota's birth rate is falling. It's really a much larger kind of social and economic change, behavioral change. Before I move on to kind of what's happening with aging, I want to check in with you and see if you have any questions for me for what I've said so far. No? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so we all know that population aging, we've been hearing about it, you know, I've been talking about it for the 15 years that I've been in this position. And Tom Gillespie, who was in this position for 30 years before me, was talking about it. This, again, is no surprise, but we are right in the middle of this kind of massive change with respect to the composition of our state. And what that looks like in graphic form, I'm sharing with you here. You can see that beginning in about 2010, our older adult population, those who are age 65 and above, began to climb. And it will continue to climb until about 2030, when the youngest of the baby boomers turns age 65. So the baby boom generation was born between 1964 and 1946. And the oldest of the baby boomers began reaching age 65 in 2011, and the youngest will reach age 65 in 2029. So you can see we're right in the middle of this transition period. We've got a few more years left, but what's happening is kind of major life transitions for people in those ages, and we're feeling it kind of in the aggregate because there are so many baby boomers in our state. What happens after 2030 is we have a younger cohort of people coming through, people in what's sometimes often called Generation X, who were born right behind the baby boomers, and there's not as many of Gen Xers. And so we won't see that same level of increase of the older adult population. But I think what's important in terms of public and policy focus is to know that the transition right now that we're experiencing to an older state is a permanent transition. That it's not like we get older for a while and then we go back to being relatively younger. When you have low birth rates and you have the aging of the population that we've experienced, you stay relatively older for the foreseeable future, which means that any kinds of policy changes, whether it's the way that we do public budgeting, whether it's the way that we distribute resources or plan our communities for older adults, they're geared toward the population that's here for the foreseeable future, that we don't expect to get to become a young state again. This is just a new age structure from here on out. Some parts of the state are older than others, and I'm sorry, it looks like my legend here has dropped off, but I will just tell you that the oldest parts of the state are in the darkest blue. So you can see Aiken County, for example, is in dark blue. That's our oldest county in the state. And then for many of our metropolitan areas, we tend to have a younger age structure. And that's because metropolitan areas tend to pull people in from around kind of the more rural region. So you can see, of course, the Twin Cities is lighter in color, meaning it's relatively young. You can see the Fargo-Moorhead area, also relatively young. Rochester down here, also in lighter blue, the Mankato area. Now, there are some exceptions where you have sometimes newer immigrant populations that will have a younger age structure. But by and large, kind of the northern part of our state tends to be a little bit older than the rest. In some instances, quite a bit older. As you can see, Aiken County, 1 out of 3 residents is above the age of 65. Whereas the statewide average is, much less than that at about 18%. There are particular policy challenges, as you well know, in rural areas, but especially as it relates to aging and the provision of care, the provision of housing that's specific to older adults, that when you have rural populations with this increased need, whether it's long-term services and supports or healthcare, and that's happening in an area where you don't have the population density and you may not have kind of the workforce needed to support that growing population, it makes for particularly difficult challenges in some of those rural areas to think about care for older adults. One more way to kind of drive home just the timing of this aging trend, because I know it's been something that's been with us for a very long time, that we've heard aging we're aging, it means something, it's coming, but we may not know specifically what or when that means, when or what that means when we say we're aging. This just kind of puts it more on a specific timeline. And if we look at kind of where the baby boomers are in their particular life transitions, we can kind of aggregate that up to all of the states and understand where the public impacts are going to be or have been. And this has turned out to be very true, that as we've seen these retirements, increased retirements, as baby boomers have turned age 65 between 2011 and 2029, we have right here the youngest, we really started to feel the impact of aging on our workplaces. You know, in the mid 2010s is when we really started feeling workforce shortages start to arise. It became very acute. I heard it from many different employers, from school districts, from, you know, people in state government and the executive branch, you know, just how do we find the workers that we need? Especially before the pandemic, we really started to see these worker shortages open up. And we've seen them again after the pandemic, after kind of the disruptions that were due related to the pandemic kind of regulated again or moderated again. We started to see these workforce shortages open up again. And again, very predictable, related to all those retirements that were happening. We can see the same amount of predictability right now if we think about the baby boomers reaching age 75 and above. These are the ages where we tend to have higher rates of disability, where we have more needs for long-term services and supports. And that's where we really begin to feel it in terms of our public budget. And I've heard the last, you know, I would say 2 to 3 budget cycles, we all have heard that there's a structural budget problem related to kind of what we expect for the need for future services compared to the revenue. And so I would just point out that kind of some of those impacts of aging that we have known are coming for a very long time. If we look at this timeline, you know, it really kind of drives home that the impact of aging on healthcare, on long-term services and supports, and on public budgets, that's really getting much more, I guess, acute right now, just because of where baby boomers are in their life course. I want to focus on
Susan?
question. Yeah.
Yeah. What happens with, as I've also paid a little bit of attention to what's going on medically with the extending life? Does that get factored into these numbers, or are you, I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen projections that are dramatic. You know, I can remember talking to a vice president of Medtronic back about 25 years ago. And he told me at that time that they suspected that, in terms of the research they were doing, they could extend life. Now, the caveat wasn't referring to quality of life, just extending life, but
Yeah.
they could extend life in 25 years to 50% greater than what it currently was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you start thinking about numbers like that, that just blows everything in terms of,
Yeah.
you know, pensions and healthcare needs and everything else. It's such a dramatic change. It's unbelievable. And I'm wondering
Yeah.
how, does this reflect any of that or not? It doesn't look like it does.
No, it doesn't yet. And that's not to say that it couldn't have that impact, but it is to say that it hasn't had an impact in a way that is so different from what we've experienced in the past that it changes our trajectory of what we expect for the future. And that's because as medical advancements, of course, are out there and they are extending life for some people, we also have, you know, such a rise in chronic disease for so many people that isn't fully countered by some of those, you know, medical interventions that can't counter what's happening with a large share of the population in terms of whether it's diabetes or whether it's another kind of heart type of a condition that's related, that's kind of spreading. By and large, so far, that has kind of balanced out.
Yeah, and I think realistically, COVID took a big chunk out of the senior population.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
So the most fragile, certainly, we saw increased mortality around that time. But even for long-term kind of changes in life expectancy, if we look at that year over year, there have been minor changes, increases. It kind of stalled out around the opioid epidemic when that was at its height for younger ages. But we still haven't seen life expectancies go much beyond 80 at this point, average life expectancy, for the average person at birth. So it's not that it couldn't happen, it's just that it's not happening with enough people right now that it's changing the overall population level life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So the same thing that's happening with the population growth overall is happening with the workforce. And so businesses are feeling that right now. And here's just I showed you a similar graph. This is a little bit shorter timeline quite a bit shorter, starting in 1970 and going through 2040. And we're just showing the number of people in the state who are available to work. They're the right ages to work. Whether or not they participate in the workforce or whether or not they're actually employed, that's another question. But this is just the whole pool of people who are of typical working age. And you can see it's slowed. And what we've seen during that time, particularly since the mid 2010s, is businesses and employers of all types, whether it's private or public, have had more challenges finding the workers that they need to do their jobs. And again, this is something that's not unique to Minnesota. This is the 16 to 64-year-old population by region of the state. And you can see that the Northeast, the Midwest, and even the Western states have seen this slowdown in population growth of the working age population. Even the fastest growing region of the US, the South, is also seeing this slowdown. They're seeing much higher growth than we are, but just, in their own way, it's slowing down. And if we look around, we get a similar pattern that we saw when we saw the aging. I mean, there's similar patterning in that the younger regions of the state are the states where we have more growth in the workforce. You can see that the blue counties here are the counties that are showing some amount of growth in the working age population between 2014 and 2024. The red counties that you see here have shown an increase. This is numeric increase, so you can see St. Louis County stands out in terms of population loss of working age population over that time. But again, our metro counties stand out a bit. You can see the Olmsted County, Clay County, and the Twin Cities Metro, except for Ramsey County. You can see that there has been growth in the working age population over that time, but for vast regions of the state, we see ongoing declines in the prime working age population. What's happening with labor force participation during that time? So, sorry, I don't mean to make you dizzy with going back and forth, but in general, with the working age population that we have, it's leveled off statewide. So we just don't have we have about the same number of people available to work today as we did 10 years ago statewide. And of those people, who's participating in the labor force, who's not participating in the labor force, well, we can look back, to 2000 and see that there has been some growth in labor force participation among older adults. So you can see this dark blue line here is in 2000. This is the rate of labor force participation at each age group. And you can see that between then and 2023, there have been increases for these age groups. But it's also important to understand that the labor force participation drops off really pretty quickly after about the age of 60 or so. And so we're still seeing people move into retirement very rapidly after that age, whether it's because they have the good fortune of doing so and have the resources to be able to do that, or whether it's because their work isn't tenable for them because of health reasons or reasons related to disability or the type of job that they have. We've also seen a decline at the same time that we've seen an increase in labor force participation among older adults. We've seen a decline in labor force participation among teenagers. And then overall, I guess it's important to note that during all this, the period of the last 15 years or so, the labor force participation of people in their prime working years has remained pretty stable. We've seen a little bit more participation of people kind of in their, early work years, but generally over this period, it's stayed really high and hasn't been very responsive to the fact that we have a very tight labor market where we think people might otherwise be pulled in because there are more jobs. That hasn't happened. Instead, we've just seen this kind of very high, maybe we've reached a ceiling in terms of labor force participation, at least in terms of the mix of jobs, the type of work schedules, the type of pay that people can expect for the education that they have. This has remained kind of pretty stable over time. So if we're not going to be growing at the same level as we have in the past, one of the things that we can look to is migration to grow our state, to grow our workforce. And so I'm going to share with you just what migration has looked like over the past couple of decades. The gray bars are showing you the number of people that we lost each year due to domestic migration. And so gray bars that you see negative from 2000 to up through 2023 are showing you that more people have moved away from Minnesota to other states than have moved into Minnesota. And now the blue bars are showing you the number of people who on net who we've gained due to international migration. So this is a net number. It just takes together everyone who's moving in versus moving out and gives us whether it's positive or negative, the result of all that moving. The line on this graph is showing you if you added together in any given year, the blue bar and the gray bar, this is the total number of people migrating in or out, whether from domestic or international migration. And so looking at this graph, in the 1990s, we had both positive international and domestic migration, and we had quite high numbers each year. We reached 20,000, for example. In some of these years, that was the number of people added to the state in any given year because of migration. The numbers have been much lower in total and even dipping negative here and there. Mostly because we have more out-migration to other states than we have in-migration historically in Minnesota. Now in 2025, we actually had a positive bright spot. We had more people moving in than moving away. You can see that here. We've seen a few areas where that's happened in the past 25 years or so, but it has not been the norm. The pattern that's been pretty established has been more out-migration than in-migration. And again, this is like other states in our region, in our neighborhood of states. Midwestern states and Northeastern states tend to see this pattern. And so I'd love to see this turn around. Many people in state government and elsewhere would love to see this number turn around, but I'm just cautiously optimistic to see what comes next year when we get the data release and see if we get another year of positive migration. Now, if we look at international migration, what's been happening is consistently positive all the way through. We consistently gain people due to international migration, and these are people who are coming as part of refugee admissions programs. These are economic migrants, high skill, lower skill, international students. This is an estimate of all types of migration in and out of the US and people kind of leaving Minnesota or coming to Minnesota from abroad. The number, you know, it's kind of ebbed and flowed, but we saw really a big increase between 2022 and 2024 due to humanitarian admits at the southern border. So this was true of the US overall, and it also impacted Minnesota, where we saw more international migrants coming to the state because of that flow of people up through the southern border. Now this year, we've actually seen that number cut in half, and the US has seen more than half, and the US has seen that number drop as well. And that has to do with federal immigration policies, both that have changed policy at the southern border, that have put caps on refugee admissions. And this only goes through the first 6 months of 2025. And so we expect that next year, if the policies that we've seen in place since January of 2025, if they continue, you know, through this year, we expect to see almost no international migration on net to the state or really to the US. And so that will have implications for our population projections, for the number of workers available. This growth of international immigrants, while not all workers, these are people of all ages coming for all purposes, it was kind of quietly boosting labor force participation in a way that for a while economists didn't really understand why the labor force was growing until the population projections caught up and we said, oh, we had more migration than we thought we had, and that's why we were able to continue to add jobs and grow the labor force, because otherwise it just didn't make sense that it was growing given the population numbers that we had had. Are there any questions about this before I move on?
I have a specific question on higher education.
Yeah.
What are we seeing on higher education? My numbers are old in terms of what I was looking at after 9/11, way back when. I know we had a significant drop off for a period of time of people coming in on H-1B.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happened recently, but I do know that there's been a number of universities that have started operating foreign, particularly high-end prestigious universities are starting to add operations overseas, quite frankly. And I'm wondering if that's having an impact. And University of Minnesota, when I was at the High Tech Association, we were always paying a lot of attention to the IT and engineering in particular. And they were starting to feel it too, I'll tell you that. But my numbers are pretty old, so I don't know if that's rebounded or if that's what's happening in that regard.
Yeah, so my understanding, and I don't have a specific read school by school or just in terms of enrollments, but when I talk to educators, what I've understand that they've felt, many schools have felt declining enrollments because of lower birth rates and because of the fact that it's not just Minnesota, it's kind of the region of states that we're pulling from is in a slower growth or a declining enrollment kind of a scenario, like a projection for fewer high school graduates. So my understanding is that they've looked to international students to kind of fill that enrollment gap in recent years, over the last 10 years, that has been one strategy that many states and even regional kind of metro Minnesota state schools have also kind of done this, not across the board, but on a kind of case by case basis. Those different schools have pulled in more international students as enrollments have declined as a strategy.
But is that getting more difficult to do? I know that was a strategy, but what's happened in recent years?
Yeah, so my understanding is that under between in the last kind of Trump administration that it became more difficult. I haven't heard specifically in 2025 if that has been the case, but I know that I heard between 2017 and 2021 that it was getting harder to secure visas, or it was taking much longer for those visas to process than it normally would. And so when you have longer processing, it also reduces the number of overall people who are able to flow in any given time period. Yeah. We do see increasing educational attainment of our young people. That's something that has not gone away. We've continued to see gains in that respect. One thing that I'm telling legislators, especially on workforce committees, is one of the strategies to counter slower workforce growth is to increase the skills and abilities and educational attainment of the workers who are already here. And we can see that for Minnesota workers, these are everyone who's in the labor force, that there is a large share of the population of all ages who have high school graduation or less. And so there is opportunity there to continue to increase kind of the skills, the productivity, if you will, of the workers that we do have. And that's an important strategy, that we continue to focus on, especially under this slow growth scenario. Our state continues to become more racially and ethnically diverse. About a third of, or about a quarter of our state's workers are people of color. About half are women. About a third are parents. And about 12% were born in a country outside of the United States. And I point this out because as that workforce growth slows, we have to be much more kind of aware of the context and situations of the workers that we do have in terms of barriers to increase, worker skills, to reduce barriers to labor force participation. So things like policies that make it easier for parents to work or less expensive through childcare kinds of policies become more important in this slow growth scenario. And just to give you a sense of how the state is changing with respect to racial and ethnic diversity, we can see here up through the last census that I'm showing you only populations of color here. We've seen increase in all populations of color, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Asian, and mixed race shown there in purple. American Indian, Native, Indigenous populations have remained pretty stable over time. They don't have the same benefit of in-migration as some of the other groups do. That population has, kind of remained about the same throughout. While we've seen growth in the other populations, especially among Black or African American. And in terms of international immigration, if we go back to 1920, which was, near the height of in-migration, or at least the height of the share of the population that's foreign born, you can see that we had many more people coming from Sweden, Norway, Germany, excuse me. And today, our migrants in Minnesota are coming, excuse me, are coming from all over the globe. So we've seen both an increase in international migration as evidenced by the number of foreign-born residents in the state. And we've seen that, incredible diversity of geographies, of locations from which people are coming from all over the US, including Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We know that the state will continue to become more racially diverse as we age, just because our young people are much more diverse than our older population. In Minnesota right now, more than a third of preschoolers, people aged 0 to 4, are people of color, children of color, compared to about 5% of 85-year-olds and people over the age of 85. So as those young people age into their parenting ages, they'll have more children of color. And so our state becomes more diverse just because of this fact, what we're looking at right here, without any kind of movement from abroad. We know that we'll continue to become a more diverse state just because our young people are more diverse than our older generations. We continue to see big differences both in educational attainment by race, but also in labor force participation by race. And some of this has to do with the age of different cultural groups. Some of our kind of newer immigrant groups tend to be younger, and so they're more likely to be enrolled in school, and they're also more likely to be parents, which might take them out of the workforce. But even with all else being equal, we do see differences in labor force participation depending on which group we're looking at. And so it's just kind of one more dimension of how we make sure that all Minnesotans are participating in the workforce to the extent that they want to be able to do that and to the extent that they can contribute in that way. There are racial and ethnic related barriers that need to be overcome. Finally, I just wanted to point out that we're in this slow growth period. It means something a little bit different for economic development than we might otherwise be thinking about. And that is that we need to be thinking about jobs that are the most important to fill and not just all jobs. So, our economic development friends oftentimes are focused on bringing jobs to the state, or historically have been bringing a large number of jobs to the state, whereas what we're needing to see recently is jobs in specific areas. Now, this list comes from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it came out of the pandemic, that they were able to put together this list of jobs that were essential during the pandemic. And I'm not saying that our jobs under this slow growth scenario need to be the same as this set of jobs, but I just present, an example of how we may elevate some jobs over others with respect to public policy. And I think that's already begun to happen. We already see that the jobs, especially in healthcare, in long-term services and supports, that legislators and others in state government are looking at ways that we make sure that those essential jobs are filled at a time where it's hard to find workers. And so to wrap it all up with a bow here, I do expect that population growth and workforce growth will continue to be slow. International migration is really the most realistic mechanism for future growth. And I say that because there is a pool of people who are willing to move to the US, willing to move to Minnesota if they are able to find a legal pathway to do that. And it's much harder to change kind of the domestic flow of migrants out of Minnesota and out of the Midwest than maybe that's wrong to say. It's much easier. It's much easier to change federal policy, immigration policy, than a flow of young people around the U.S. But to me, that's kind of like the most realistic mechanism for changing the trajectory of our growth. And that's because birth rates aren't going to turn around. Domestic migration will be hard to turn around. And so for me, it really hinges on changes to international migration if we're going to see changes in future growth. Under this slow growth context, education continues to be very important, if not even more important than when we had higher growth scenarios. And that's because we need to make sure that the people who are here working are living to, are working to their highest potential. And again, we need to kind of focus on essential industries that we need to make sure jobs are filled in those industries, especially in caregiving types of occupations and industries. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Do you anticipate that climate change is going to have an impact on our in-migration from other states, Southern particularly?
Yeah, I sure think it could. Hang on one second. I'll stop my share so I can see you better. I think it will eventually have an impact, and it will eventually have a big impact. And there's a number of mechanisms that will displace people because of climate change in the US. So there's the fact that we have so much population on our coasts where there's rising sea levels. Those people eventually will be displaced, or many of those people will be eventually displaced. There's the issue of water supply, and the scarcest water supply being in areas that are most impacted by climate change, and the areas that are seeing the most in-migration in the southwest of the US. There's agricultural patterns where food is produced. So there's all these different, and natural disasters. So there's all these different things related to climate change that could impact where people move. And yes, it's absolutely plausible that we will see changes eventually due to those changes. Predicting it is much harder. There are people who have tried to predict it. What they have projections so far on a county by county basis is that people who are somewhat inland from the coasts and the south are going to see the most in migration, because people tend to move short distances rather than picking up and fully moving long distances, even if it's safer. And they base that off of kind of things that happened after Katrina, for example. What happened in terms of migration then? So my best answer is yes, it's going to impact, but not in a way that I can predict well, or that I'm willing to kind of say with certainty when or how the impact will land.
We could have a big advertising campaign. It's cool in Minnesota.
And we have water.
It's cool.
We've got water, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence is supposedly going to displace tens of thousands of workers. And I'm going to guess it's impossible to predict how that is going to shake out. But couldn't that have really far-reaching consequences about what is available for jobs, what kind of jobs those people are going to have, in order to attract them into healthcare? Are we going to have to increase our contributions to healthcare substantially so that people start having living wages? It's got to be a whole series of very difficult kinds of prognostications.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought it up. And in fact, the Jobs Committee brought this up as well.
Hmm.
Yes.
And I want to add real quickly on that. Not only do you have that, but you've got robotics. I mean, go out to Silicon Valley and look at the combination of AI companies and robotic companies that
Yeah.
are have a long list of names that I couldn't even don't even recognize. I mean, but that combination is going to change things as we're projecting things as they are in terms of demographics in some cases. The work world is changing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So
but it's not just AI, it's also robotics.
yeah, yeah. No, those are both great points. I can continue to the part that I got drawn to learning about demographics is just how easy it is to predict. So the people side is very easy to predict because it's based on births, deaths, and migration. It doesn't have a lot of impacts due to like the economy does. There have been some studies that have looked at job occupations by the bundle of tasks that are able to be replaced right now by robotics or by other kind of technologies. And those are kind of interesting studies to kind of guess what might happen. And then there are studies that have tried to look at what AI might do to jobs. And when I've looked at those projections, they've said, oh, either we will need no jobs or we will need so many more jobs. It's been the projections are all over the map. So like climate change, I expect those changes, will be significant. But right now I haven't seen kind of a reasonable projection of what exactly it means. But it's important to put a pin in it and say this is also a factor that's going to be a real and significant factor. Yeah. I guess the other thing is that, listening to our Federal Reserve Bank president talking about the impact of AI, we have a sense that it's going to take place, that the implementation of both robotics and AI is going to happen much faster than it actually is. And I guess for AI, the uptake has been very fast. But for robotics, it's been slower, I guess, because it's a much more expensive thing to do to implement robotics in hospitals, for example, requires changing infrastructure that, yes, that's happening. Yes, hospitals are changing the way they build, they're built, even including down in the Mayo Clinic, we're hearing that they're doing full highways for robots to come through and move goods within the hospitals, which will increase productivity for sure. It's another piece of this that is separate from demographics, but certainly changes the context of what I'm talking about today.
And I know we're at the tail end of this conversation. It's been fantastic. I just want to add one little thing. Red Wing, Minnesota has a company, robotics assisted manufacturing, that was started by a friend of mine, as a matter of fact. And back in the 90s, they created the first robot arm for McDonald's. So if you go into French frying robot arms, and then Schwann's ended up buying them out, and I don't know where it is now because of Schwann's situation. But anyway, that was one of the first applications of robotics in a non-traditional manufacturing role. But it was done right here in Minnesota.
Cool.
So
I hadn't ever heard that. That's really cool.
yeah, it was Ram Company, robotics assisted manufacturing. But anyway, this has been a fantastic discussion. It's a lot to think about, quite frankly. Um, and it's one of the things I don't know how much we think about when we're making public policy decisions, that we need to be spending more time on this type of a topic, quite frankly. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been great. And it's been recorded if we, tell people who want to look at it again. And I know that happens and it's worthwhile. So thank you again, Susan. Appreciate it very much. And thank everybody for participating.
Thanks for having me.
Mhm.
Good to talk with
Really
you all.
interesting program. Thank you.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
bet. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye
Bye.
now.